The gunshot wound in her side was bleeding through the makeshift bandage, and Cade Whitmore knew if he did not get this woman to shelter within the next hour, she would die on the back of his horse. He had found her collapsed near Skull Creek, delirious and burning with fever, her dress torn and dusty from what must have been days of wandering through the Arizona wilderness. The year was 1878, and this part of the territory between Jerome Junction and the mountain ranges was unforgiving to those who did not know its ways. Cade had lived in these mountains for the better part of 6 years, trapping and hunting, trading pelts when he needed supplies, and keeping mostly to himself in a cabin he had built with his own hands near a cold stream that never ran dry. The woman moaned against his chest, her body radiating heat even through the layers of buckskin he wore. Dark hair clung to her sweat-soaked face, and her breathing came shallow and rapid. Cade urged his horse faster, his powerful arms wrapped securely around her slight frame. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and arms corded with muscle from years of hard labor in the wilderness. His dark brown hair hung past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his jaw was shadowed with several days of stubble. His blue eyes, usually sharp and watchful, now held a desperate concern as he glanced down at the woman who had somehow survived long enough for him to find her. When his cabin finally came into view through the pines, relief flooded through him. He dismounted in one smooth motion, cradling the woman against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all. She was small in his arms, her body racked with shivers despite the fierce heat radiating from her skin. He kicked the cabin door open and carried her directly to his bed, the only real piece of furniture he owned besides a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. The bed was built sturdy from pine logs, covered with furs and blankets he had accumulated over the years. Cade laid her down gently and immediately set about building up the fire. The cabin was cool from the mountain air, but he needed hot water, and he needed it quickly. He filled his largest pot from the water barrel he kept inside and hung it over the fire, then turned his attention back to the woman. Her dress was ruined, caked with dirt and blood, and he knew he would have to remove it to properly tend her wounds. His hands, so capable with an axe or a rifle, hesitated for just a moment before he reminded himself that modesty had no place when a life hung in the balance. He cut the dress away carefully, preserving what decency he could while exposing the wound in her side. The bullet had passed through cleanly, which was fortunate, but the entry and exit wounds were angry and inflamed. Infection had already set in, which explained the fever that was consuming her. Cade had seen men die from less serious wounds that had gone untended. He worked with steady hands, cleaning the wounds with water he had boiled and cooled slightly, then applying a poultice made from herbs he kept dried and stored in jars along his cabin wall. Yarrow to stop bleeding, golden seal to fight infection, and willow bark which he would brew into a tea to help with the fever and pain. Once he had bandaged her properly with clean cloth strips, he covered her with blankets and turned his attention to getting fluids into her. She was unconscious now, her body fighting a battle she might not win. Cade brewed the willow bark tea and waited for it to cool enough that it would not burn her mouth. He lifted her head gently, supporting her against his arm, and coaxed small sips of the tea between her cracked lips. Most of it dribbled down her chin at first, but he persisted with patient determination until he was satisfied she had gotten at least some of the medicine into her. The first night was the worst. Cade pulled a chair beside the bed and did not leave her side. The fever raged through her body, making her thrash and cry out in delirium. She spoke in fragments, calling out names he did not recognize, pleading with people who were not there. Once she opened her eyes and looked directly at him, but he could tell she did not see him, lost somewhere in the landscape of her fever dreams. He bathed her face and arms with cool water, changed the bandages when they needed changing, and kept forcing small amounts of liquid into her whenever she was calm enough to swallow. Morning came gray and cold through the single window of his cabin. Cade's eyes burned with exhaustion, but the woman's fever had not broken. If anything, she seemed worse, her skin burning hot to the touch, her breathing labored and uneven. He made more tea, added honey from the small jar he had traded 4 months ago, and once again went through the slow process of getting her to drink it. His body ached from sitting in the chair all night, his muscles stiff from lack of movement, but he did not even consider lying down to rest. Something had shifted inside him from the moment he had found her. Cade had lived alone for years, preferring the company of mountains and animals to the complications that came with other people. He had his reasons, ghosts from a past he tried not to think about, wounds that had scarred over but never fully healed. Yet looking at this woman, so vulnerable and fighting for her life, had awakened something in him he thought had died long ago. A need to protect, to care for someone other than himself. A connection he could not name or explain, as if some invisible thread had been tied between them the moment his eyes had found her collapsed form by the creek. The second day passed in much the same way as the first night. Cade tended her wounds, changed her bandages, and tried to keep her fever from climbing higher. He spoke to her sometimes, his deep voice low and soothing, telling her she was safe now, that she needed to fight, that she could not give up. He did not know if she could hear him in whatever dark place the fever had taken her, but the words seemed important somehow, as if speaking them aloud could anchor her to the living world. By the second night, Cade's exhaustion had become something almost tangible, a weight pressing down on him from all sides. His eyes felt full of sand, and his head pounded with a dull ache that spread down his neck and into his shoulders. He had been awake for 2 full days and nights now, and his body was demanding rest with an insistence that was hard to ignore. Several times he caught himself nodding off in the chair, his chin dropping to his chest before he jerked awake again with a start. But every time sleep tried to claim him, he looked at the woman in his bed and forced himself to stay alert. She was worse now, her fever climbing to dangerous heights despite everything he had done. Her skin was dry and burning, her lips cracked and bleeding. The wounds in her side looked somewhat better, the angry redness beginning to fade, but the infection in her blood was the real enemy now. Cade knew that the next several hours would determine whether she lived or died. He stood and walked to his water barrel, splashing the cold water on his face, letting the shock of it drive back the fog of exhaustion. Then he returned to her side and began the work again. Cool cloths on her forehead, her wrists behind her neck. Small sips of water and medicine, forced between her lips with patient persistence. He changed her bandages again, noting with some relief that the wounds were definitely beginning to heal, even if her body was still fighting the poison in her blood. As the third night wore on toward morning, Cade found himself talking to her more, his words sometimes rambling with fatigue but always sincere. He told her about the mountains, about the first time he had seen this land and known he had to stay. He told her about the cabin he had built log by log, about winters so cold, the snow piled higher than the roof, about springs when the meadows burst into color with wildflowers that seemed to carpet the world. He told her things he had never told anyone, words flowing from some deep well inside him that exhaustion had unlocked. Somewhere in the darkest hour before dawn, when Cade's eyes were so heavy he could barely keep them open, the woman stirred. It was different from the restless thrashing of fever, a more purposeful movement. Cade leaned forward, his hand reaching automatically to check her forehead, and his heart leaped. The skin under his palm was still warm, but the terrible burning heat had diminished. He pressed his palm to her cheeks, her neck, hardly daring to believe what he was feeling. The fever had broken. Relief hit him with such force that he had to brace himself against the edge of the bed. For a moment, he simply sat there, his head bowed, breathing deeply as the tension that had been holding him upright for 3 days finally released its grip. The woman slept peacefully now, her breathing deep and even, the worst of the crisis past. She was not out of danger yet, still weak and recovering, but she would live. Cade was suddenly sure of it with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason. Only then did he allow himself to rest. He did not make it to the other room where he kept spare blankets for sleeping on the floor. Instead, he slumped in the chair beside the bed, his arms folded on the mattress next to her, his head pillowed on his arms. Sleep took him instantly, pulling him down into darkness so complete it was like falling into a well. When Cade woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and his body felt like it had been trampled by horses. Every muscle ached, his neck was stiff from the awkward position he had slept in, and his mouth was dry as dust. He lifted his head slowly, groaning softly at the protest from his back and shoulders, and immediately turned his attention to the woman. She was still sleeping, but it was true restful sleep now, not the terrible unconsciousness of fever. Her color looked better, her breathing steady and unlabored. Cade stood carefully, his joints creaking, and shuffled to the water barrel. He drank deeply, splashed water on his face again, and then checked the fire. It had burned down to embers, so he built it back up and put coffee on to boil. The familiar routine of these simple tasks helped ground him, bringing him fully back to awareness. He had slept for hours by the angle of the sun, longer than he had intended, but the woman seemed no worse for his inattention. He made himself eat, though he had little appetite, knowing he needed to rebuild his strength. Dried venison and journey bread washed down with strong coffee. As he ate, he found himself studying the woman with curiosity. Who was she? How had she ended up shot and wandering alone in the wilderness? She was beautiful, even haggard with illness as she was. Her features were delicate but with a certain strength to them, her dark hair spread across his pillow, her hands small and fine-boned where they rested on top of the blankets. He was cleaning up from his meal when he heard her stir. Turning quickly, he saw her eyes flutter open. They were brown, he noted, a warm, deep brown that reminded him of good earth. For a moment she simply stared at the ceiling, confusion clear on her face, and then her eyes found him. Alarm flashed across her features, and she tried to sit up, only to fall back with a gasp of pain. "Easy," Cade said, moving to her side, his voice gentle despite his rough appearance. "You are safe. You were hurt badly. You need to rest." She stared at him with wide eyes, her hand moving instinctively to her side where the bandages wrapped around her ribs. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse and weak, barely above a whisper. "My cabin. In the mountains above Jerome Junction. I found you 3 days ago near Skull Creek. You had been shot and you had a bad fever." Cade poured water into a tin cup and helped her lift her head to drink. She took small, careful sips, and he could see her taking in her surroundings, assessing the situation. 3 days, she repeated when he lowered her back down. "I do not remember." "The fever had you bad. You have been unconscious most of the time. Do you remember what happened to you? Who shot you?" Her face went through a series of emotions, fear and pain, and something that might have been anger. "Outlaws," she said finally. "They attacked the stage I was on, killed the driver and the guard. The other passengers ran, but one of them shot me when I would not." She stopped, her jaw clenching. "I got away into the rocks. I walked for a long time. Everything after that is confused." Cade felt a surge of anger at the men who had done this, but he kept his voice calm. "You are safe now. They are not going to find you here. What is your name?" "Julia," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Julia Fletcher." "I am Cade Whitmore. You are welcome to stay here as long as you need to heal. I know it is not much, but you will be safe." Julia's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "Thank you. I thought I was going to die out there. I remember being so thirsty, so hot. Everything seemed like a dream." "You nearly did die," Cade said honestly. "The fever was bad, but you were strong. You fought through it. You saved my life." It was a statement, not a question, and her eyes held his with an intensity that made something shift in his chest. "I did what anyone would do," he said, looking away from that gaze, suddenly uncomfortable with the gratitude and something else he saw there. "No," Julia said softly, "not anyone. Most men would have left me, or worse. You stayed with me. I can see it in your face, how tired you are. You did not sleep, did you? While I was sick?" Cade did not know how to answer that. The truth was he could not have slept even if he had wanted to. Something about this woman had gotten past all the walls he had built, had made it impossible for him to do anything but stay by her side. "You needed looking after," he said gruffly. "Rest now. You need to regain your strength." Over the following days, Julia slowly improved. Cade was attentive to her needs, helping her sit up to eat, changing her bandages with careful hands, supporting her when she needed to move. He slept near the fire at night, giving her privacy and the comfort of the bed, though he woke frequently to check on her. The routine of caring for her became natural, and he found himself looking forward to the times she was awake and they could talk. Julia told him her story gradually, pieces emerging as she grew stronger. She had been traveling from Missouri to California, fleeing an arranged marriage her father had tried to force upon her. She had some money she had saved secretly over the years, enough to buy stage passage and hopefully start a new life, somewhere she could make her own choices. The outlaw attack had taken everything, her money, her belongings, nearly her life. She had nothing now except the borrowed shirt Cade had dressed her in after cutting away her ruined dress. Cade found himself drawn to her strength, to the determination he saw in her eyes, even when she was weak and hurting. She did not complain about the pain, did not weep over her losses. Instead, she focused on healing, on regaining her strength. She asked him about his life, and slowly, haltingly, he told her things he had not spoken of in years. About the war he had fought in as a young man, about coming west afterward to escape the memories, about the brother he had lost to fever during the war, about parents long dead, about choosing solitude because it was simpler than risking caring about people who could be taken away. "That is not really living," Julia said one afternoon as she sat propped up against pillows, her color much improved, her eyes clear and thoughtful. "Hiding from hurt means hiding from everything good too." "Maybe," Cade acknowledged, stirring the stew he was making for their dinner. "But it is simpler." "Simpler does not mean better." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and felt something tighten in his chest. She was beautiful in the afternoon light, her dark hair clean now from the careful washing he had helped her with, falling in waves around her shoulders. The borrowed shirt, one of his own, hung loose on her smaller frame, but she wore it with a dignity that made it seem almost elegant. More than her physical beauty, though, there was something about her spirit, her refusal to be broken by what had happened to her, that called to something deep inside him. "What will you do?" he asked, turning back to the stew to hide the confusion of his own feelings. "When you are well enough to travel?" Julia was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know," she admitted. "I have no money to continue to California. I suppose I could try to find work in Jerome Junction, though I do not know what skills I have that anyone would pay for. I can read and write, do numbers well enough. Maybe someone needs a shop clerk or a teacher." The thought of her leaving, of this cabin being empty again after she was gone, created a hollow feeling in Cade's chest that he did not want to examine too closely. He told himself it was just because he had grown used to having her here, to having someone to talk to after so many years alone. But he knew it was more than that. Somewhere in the days and nights of caring for her, of watching her fight to survive, of learning her story and sharing his own, something had fundamentally shifted inside him. As the second week passed and Julia grew strong enough to move around the cabin, Cade found himself hyper-aware of her presence. The cabin that had always seemed adequately sized now felt small with both of them in it. He was conscious of where she was every moment, of the sound of her voice, the way she moved. He caught himself watching her as she stood by the window looking out at the mountains, or as she sat at his table mending the spare clothes he had given her to wear, her fingers nimble with needle and thread. Julia seemed equally aware of him. He would look up from whatever task he was doing to find her eyes on him, a thoughtful expression on her face. Once he came back from checking his snares to find her attempting to cook dinner as a surprise, and the grateful smile she gave him when he offered to help made his heart do strange things in his chest. They moved around each other in a careful dance, both aware of the growing tension between them, neither quite ready to acknowledge it. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Julia broke the comfortable silence between them. "Cade, why did you stay awake for 3 days taking care of me? You did not know me. I was a stranger. You could have done the basic necessities and rested." Cade stared into the fire, his strong hands clasped between his knees. It was a question he had asked himself many times, and he still did not have an answer that made logical sense. "I do not know," he said finally. "I just knew I could not let you die. From the moment I found you, something," he struggled for words, "something felt different, important, like I was supposed to find you, supposed to help you." "I felt it too," Julia said softly, "even in the fever dreams. I knew someone was there, keeping me safe. I could hear your voice sometimes, telling me to fight. It gave me something to hold on to." Their eyes met across the fire, and Cade saw in her gaze a reflection of everything he was feeling. The connection between them was undeniable now, a living thing that seemed to fill the space between them. He saw the moment Julia made her decision, saw the fear and courage mixing in her expression as she stood and moved to where he sat. "I know this is not proper," she said, standing before him, "and I know I have no right to expect anything from you. But I need you to know that these weeks here, recovering, talking with you, have been the happiest I can remember. You have shown me a kindness I have never known. You have made me feel safe and valued and—" She paused, gathering her courage, "and cared for in a way that goes beyond duty." Cade stood slowly, his height and breadth making Julia seem even more delicate as she tilted her head back to look up at him. His heart was pounding hard enough that he thought she must be able to hear it. "Julia," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "you have turned my world upside down. This cabin has been empty for so long, and I thought I liked it that way. But having you here has shown me I was not living, just existing. You are brave and strong and beautiful, and I—" He reached up carefully, his large hand cupping her face with a gentleness that belied his strength. "I do not want you to leave." "Then ask me to stay," Julia whispered, her hand coming up to cover his where it rested against her cheek. "Stay," Cade said, "not as a guest or someone I'm helping. Stay as—" He struggled with words that felt too big and too important. "Stay because I am falling in love with you, and I cannot imagine this place without you anymore." Julia's smile was radiant, tears shining in her eyes. "I am falling in love with you too. I think I started that first moment I woke up and saw you there, so fierce and protective and gentle all at once. I want to stay, Cade. I want to build a life here with you." When he kissed her, it was with all the pent-up emotion of the past weeks, all the fear he had felt when her life hung in the balance, all the joy of discovering she felt the same way he did. Julia melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment the world consisted of nothing but the two of them, the fire crackling beside them, and the enormous relief of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "I should court you properly," he said, "take you to town, let people know my intentions. I do not want anyone thinking I took advantage." Julia laughed softly. "Cade, you saved my life. You gave me your bed while you slept on the floor. You have been nothing but honorable. But yes, we can do this properly if that is what you want. Though I have to warn you, I have no interest in a long courtship. I have wasted too much of my life being afraid to choose what I wanted. I know what I want now, and it is you." The next day, Cade rode into Jerome Junction with Julia seated before him on his horse, his arm wrapped protectively around her. The town was small, a collection of buildings built to serve the miners and ranchers who worked the harsh Arizona territory. Cade had never spent much time there beyond trading for supplies, but now he moved through the streets with purpose. He took Julia to the general store first, where he bought her a proper dress, boots, and the various things she needed. The storekeeper's wife, a kind woman named Mrs. Henderson, was delighted to help Julia select what she needed and tactfully asked no questions about where she had come from or why she was with the mountain man everyone knew only by reputation. From there, Cade took Julia to the church, where he introduced her to Reverend Matthews and made his intentions clear. He wanted to marry Julia Fletcher, if she would have him, and he wanted to do it right. The Reverend, an older man with shrewd eyes that had seen much of human nature, looked between them and seemed satisfied with what he saw. He agreed to post the banns and marry them in 3 weeks' time if that was their wish. As they rode back to the cabin in the fading afternoon light, Julia turned in the saddle to look up at Cade. 3 weeks, she said. "Are you sure you will not change your mind about me by then?" Cade tightened his arm around her, pulling her more securely against his chest. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life. Are you sure? This is not an easy life up here. Winters are hard, and I am not an easy man. I've been alone a long time." "I am sure," Julia said firmly. "I would rather have a hard life with you than an easy life with anyone else. You are a good man, Cade Whitmore. Better than you give yourself credit for. You showed me that when you stayed awake 3 days to keep me alive. Love kept you alert when your body wanted rest, even though you did not know yet that you were falling in love with me. That kind of heart is rare." Those 3 weeks passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and perfect contentment. Cade taught Julia about the mountains, showing her his trap lines, teaching her to identify edible plants and animal tracks. She was an eager student, quick to learn and unafraid of the hard work required to live in such remote territory. In turn, Julia brought a warmth to the cabin that went beyond the physical presence of another person. She sang while she worked, filling the space with music. She organized his supplies, mended his clothes with neat stitches, and cooked meals that were far better than anything Cade had managed on his own. But more than the practical ways they complemented each other, there was the growing emotional and physical connection between them. Long conversations by the fire that lasted until the flames burned low. stolen kisses when Cade came in from checking the snares to find Julia waiting for him with a smile. The way her hand would find his as they sat together in the evenings. The heat that built between them, kept carefully in check by mutual agreement to wait until they were properly married. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect autumn days when the Arizona sky was impossibly blue and the air carried the first hint of winter's approach. Cade wore the best clothes he owned, his long hair tied back neatly, his beard freshly trimmed. Julia wore the dress they had bought in town, a simple design in deep blue that made her eyes shine. Mrs. Henderson had helped her arrange her hair, and Cade thought he had never seen a more beautiful sight than Julia walking toward him in the small church. The ceremony itself was simple but profound. Cade's voice was steady as he made his vows, promising to love and protect Julia for the rest of his life. Julia's voice was equally clear, promising to stand by his side through whatever trials life brought them. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared held all the love and promise of their future together. The people of Jerome Junction had turned out for the wedding, curious about the mountain man who had come down from his isolated cabin with a bride. They held a celebration in the church hall, and Cade was surprised to find himself actually enjoying the company. With Julia at his side, her hand in his, the social interaction that had always felt awkward and forced now seemed natural. She had a gift for putting people at ease, and soon she was learning names and stories, making connections that would serve them well in the years to come. As the sun began to set, Cade and Julia rode back to their cabin, truly theirs now, to begin their married life. The ride was quiet, both of them full of anticipation for the night ahead. When they arrived, Cade dismounted and lifted Julia down, but instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her across the threshold, making her laugh with delight. Inside, he set her down carefully, suddenly nervous in a way he had not been since he was a very young man. Julia seemed to sense his uncertainty, and she reached up to cup his face in her hands. "I love you," she said simply. "I am your wife, and I choose this. I choose you." Her words released the tension coiled inside him, and Cade gathered her close, kissing her with all the love and desire he had been holding back. "I love you too," he said against her lips. "From the moment I found you, you have been mine to protect, mine to care for. Now you are truly mine, and I am yours." That night they learned each other in all the ways married couples do, with tenderness and passion, with laughter and whispered words of love. Cade was gentle with Julia, mindful of her smaller size and the fact that this was new for her. Julia was brave and giving, trusting him completely. When they finally fell asleep in each other's arms, both were transformed by the joining of their bodies and souls. The months that followed were ones of deep contentment for both of them. Winter came to the mountains, bringing snow that piled high around the cabin and temperatures that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. But inside the cabin, warmth reigned. Cade and Julia settled into the rhythms of married life, learning each other's habits and preferences, building a partnership that went beyond the passion they shared. Cade taught Julia to shoot, insisting she needed to know how to defend herself when he was out checking trap lines. She turned out to be a natural with a rifle, her hand steady and her eye keen. Julia taught Cade to read better than his basic skills, spending evenings with the few books she had insisted they buy on their wedding day. She read to him by firelight, stories that transported them beyond the cabin walls to places neither had ever been. They talked endlessly about everything and nothing, learning each other's minds as thoroughly as they knew each other's bodies. Julia told Cade about her childhood in Missouri, about a mother who had died when she was young, and a father who had never recovered from the loss, about growing up knowing she was expected to marry well and produce grandchildren with no thought to her own desires or dreams, about the slow dawning realization that she had to leave or spend her whole life living according to someone else's plan. Cade shared his own pain, the memories he had kept locked away for so long, about a younger brother who had looked up to him, who had followed him into the war, about holding that brother as he died from fever in a field hospital, unable to do anything to save him, about the guilt that had driven him west, the sense that he should have died instead. Julia listened with compassion, but also with a practical wisdom that helped him see those old wounds in a new light. "You did everything you could. she said one night as they lay together in the darkness. "Just like you did everything you could for me. You cannot control death, Cade. You can only control how hard you fight for life. You fought for your brother, and you fought for me. That is what makes you who you are. That is why I love you." Her words were a balm to old hurts, and Cade felt something inside him finally begin to heal. With Julia, he was discovering that love was not something to fear, but something that made life worth living, even with all its risks and potential for pain. Spring came eventually, melting the snow and bringing new life to the mountains. It also brought changes to their household. Julia began to feel ill in the mornings, and it did not take long for them to realize she was pregnant. The news filled Cade with a mixture of joy and terror. He was going to be a father, something he had never really allowed himself to imagine. What if something went wrong? What if he failed to protect them? Julia saw the fear in his eyes and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Listen to me," she said firmly. "I am strong, and this baby is strong. We are going to be fine. You kept me alive through a gunshot wound and fever. You are not going to lose me to childbirth. I need you to believe that." Her confidence steadied him, and as the months passed and her belly grew round with their child, Cade found himself falling even more deeply in love with his wife. She bloomed with pregnancy, her beauty taking on a new radiance. He was endlessly fascinated by the changes in her body, by the movement of the baby they had created together. At night, he would rest his hand on her belly and feel their child kick, marveling at the miracle of it. As Julia's time drew near, Cade made arrangements with Mrs. Henderson to come and stay at the cabin for the birth. The older woman arrived a week before the baby was due, bringing with her years of experience attending births. Her presence was reassuring, though Cade found himself barely able to sit still as they waited. When Julia's labor began on a warm summer morning, Cade discovered that all his strength and courage meant nothing in the face of his wife's pain. He held her hand, wiped her face with cool cloths, and felt utterly helpless as the hours stretched on. Julia bore it with the same strength she had shown since the day he found her, gritting her teeth through the contractions, following Mrs. Henderson's instructions with determined focus. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Cade looked up from where he had been supporting Julia to see Mrs. Henderson holding a small red-faced infant. "You have a son," the older woman said with a smile. "A son." Cade moved to see the baby, his large hands shaking slightly as Mrs. Henderson placed the cleaned and wrapped infant in his arms. The baby was so small, so impossibly fragile-looking, with a shock of dark hair and a face screwed up in outrage at being forced into the world. Cade felt his eyes burn with tears as he looked down at his son, overwhelmed by a love so fierce it took his breath away. "Let me see him," Julia said weakly from the bed, and Cade carefully placed the baby in her arms. The look on her face as she gazed down at their son was pure wonder. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He has your eyes." They named him James, after Cade's brother, and Marcus for Julia's grandfather. James Marcus Whitmore came into the world healthy and loud, and from the first moment he had his parents wrapped completely around his tiny fingers. Cade, who had once thought himself suited only for solitude, discovered that fatherhood came naturally when it was grounded in love. He was endlessly patient with his son, this tiny person who depended entirely on them for everything. The years that followed were full and rich. James grew from an infant into a sturdy toddler who followed his father everywhere, on legs that were learning to be steady. Cade taught his son about the mountains with the same care he had once taught Julia, showing him animal tracks, teaching him to move quietly through the forest, instilling in him a respect for the land and its creatures. Julia flourished as a mother and as a woman building her own life. She started a small vegetable garden behind the cabin, coaxing food from the mountain soil through sheer determination and careful tending. She made friends with the other women in Jerome Junction during their occasional trips to town, becoming part of the community in a way Cade never could have managed alone. She was the bridge between his isolated existence and the wider world, and she navigated both with grace. 2 years after James was born, Julia gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Grace. If James had inherited his father's strong build and steady temperament, Sarah took after her mother with delicate features and a fierce spirit. From the beginning, she was determined to keep up with her older brother, following him and Cade on their explorations as soon as her little legs could carry her. Cade watched his family grow with a gratitude that never faded. Sometimes, usually in quiet moments when Julia was rocking Sarah to sleep and James was playing quietly at his feet, Cade would think back to that day he had found Julia by the creek. How close he had come to losing her before he ever knew her. How those 3 days of fighting to keep her alive had been the beginning of everything that mattered in his life now. One evening, when the children were asleep and he and Julia sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, he voiced those thoughts aloud. "I cannot imagine what my life would be if I had not found you that day," he said, "or if you had not fought through the fever." Julia leaned against his shoulder, fitting perfectly under his arm as she always had. "I think we were meant to find each other," she said. "All the terrible things that happened, the outlaws, being shot, wandering lost in the wilderness, it was all leading me to you. And you staying awake for 3 days, fighting to keep me alive when you did not even know me, that was love even before either of us recognized it as such." "Love kept me alert when my body wanted rest," Cade agreed, the memory of those exhausting days still vivid. "I could not have explained it then, but I knew I could not let you go. You were mine to protect from the moment I found you." "And you were mine to love from the moment I woke up and saw you there," Julia said. "My protector, my partner, my home." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the cabin, their children slept safe and warm. Around them, the mountains stood eternal and watchful. This life they had built together from a chance meeting and a desperate fight for survival was everything Cade had never known he wanted, and everything Julia had dreamed of without quite believing it could be real. As the years continued to pass, the Whitmore family became a fixture of the area around Jerome Junction. Cade's reputation evolved from the mysterious hermit of the mountains to the reliable guide and hunter who could be counted on for help when help was needed. He led lost travelers to safety, tracked missing livestock for ranchers, and shared his knowledge of surviving in the harsh territory with anyone willing to learn. Julia's garden expanded until she was trading vegetables and herbs with the people in town, her remedies sought after for everything from aches and pains to more serious ailments. James grew into a capable young man with his father's strength and his mother's quick mind. He learned the mountains as thoroughly as Cade knew them, but he also learned his letters and numbers from Julia, preparing for a future that might take him beyond the cabin if he chose. Sarah proved to be equally capable, insisting on learning everything her brother learned, refusing to be left behind simply because she was younger or a girl. Both children grew up knowing they were deeply loved and supported in whatever paths they chose. When James was 12 and Sarah 10, Julia gave birth to another son, Daniel. The pregnancy was unexpected, coming as it did when they had thought their family was complete, but the baby was welcomed with joy. Daniel was a surprise in other ways too, a quiet, thoughtful child who seemed to notice everything and who showed an early fascination with growing things. It was Daniel who helped Julia expand her garden even further, who experimented with different plants, who had an almost uncanny ability to coax life from seeds. The cabin expanded over the years to accommodate the growing family. Cade built an addition that gave the children their own space, then later a proper barn for the horses and supplies. What had started as a simple shelter had become a true homestead, a testament to the life he and Julia had built together. There were hard times too, of course. Winters when the cold seemed unending and supplies ran low. A year when sickness swept through Jerome Junction and Cade had to keep his family isolated in the mountains until the danger passed. Times when money was tight and Julia had to be creative to make their resources stretch. But they faced every challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each obstacle overcome. One particular winter, when James was 16, a blizzard hit the mountains with unusual fury. The snow came down so thick and fast that visibility dropped to nothing and the temperature plunged to dangerous levels. Cade had been out checking the horses in the barn when the full force of the storm hit, and he barely made it back to the cabin. For 3 days they were trapped inside, as the wind howled and the snow piled higher than the windows. On the 3rd day, they heard a desperate pounding at the door. Cade forced it open against the wind to find a young couple, barely more than teenagers, half frozen and terrified. They had been traveling to meet the young man's family in a town beyond Jerome Junction when the storm caught them. Their wagon had overturned, their horses had bolted, and they had been wandering lost when they spotted the light from the cabin's window. Without hesitation, Cade pulled them inside while Julia rushed to help. They were in bad shape, fingers and toes white with frostbite, their bodies dangerously cold. For the next several hours, Cade and Julia worked to warm them safely, treating the frostbite, feeding them warm broth, wrapping them in blankets and furs. The children helped too, James keeping the fire built high, Sarah preparing pallets near the hearth, Daniel fetching whatever supplies were needed. As Cade worked to save the young couple, he was struck by how history seemed to be echoing. Here he was again, fighting to keep strangers alive, unable to simply provide basic shelter and let fate take its course. Julia seemed to read his thoughts because when they finally had the couple stable and resting, she caught his hand and squeezed it. "It is who you are," she said quietly. "It is who we are. We fight for life. We fight for people." The young couple, once they recovered, were profoundly grateful. The young man, whose name was Thomas, told them that his fiancée Lily had been injured when the wagon overturned, and he had been terrified they would both die in the storm. "You saved our lives," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We have nothing to repay you with, but if there is ever anything we can do—" "Just live well," Cade told him. "Love each other, build a good life. That is payment enough." After the storm cleared, Cade guided Thomas and Lily down to Jerome Junction, where they were able to send word to Thomas's family and make arrangements to continue their journey. Before they left, Lily embraced Julia. "I will never forget what you and your family did for us," she said. "You are proof that there is still goodness in this world." The incident reinforced for the Whitmore children the values their parents had lived by their entire marriage. That caring for others was not a burden, but a privilege. That love expressed in action was the truest form of love. That the hard life they lived in the mountains was not just about survival, but about living with purpose and integrity. As James approached manhood, he began to talk about wanting to see more of the world beyond the mountains. It was a conversation Cade had known would come, but it still filled him with mixed emotions. He wanted his son to have every opportunity to choose his own path as Julia had once fought to do. But the thought of James leaving, of their family being separated, was painful. Julia, as usual, helped him see the situation clearly. "We cannot hold him here just because we want him close," she said one night as they prepared for bed. "He needs to find his own way, just like we did. We can only trust that we have given him a strong enough foundation that he will come back to us, or at least stay connected no matter where life takes him." When James finally left at 18, heading to California to see the ocean and explore opportunities in the growing cities there, Cade was proud even through his worry. His son rode away strong and confident, promising to write and to return for visits. Sarah, at 16, declared she had no intention of leaving. The mountains were her home, and she planned to stay and eventually build her own life there. Daniel, at 12, was too young to know what he wanted yet, but he seemed content in the gardens and greenhouses he and Julia had built. The years moved forward, as they always did. James did go to California, and he did see the ocean. He wrote long letters describing the bustling cities, the opportunities for work and education, the diversity of people and ideas. But he also wrote about missing the mountains, about remembering the lessons his father had taught him, about wanting to return. After 3 years, he did come home, bringing with him a wife he had met in California, a sensible woman named Catherine, who fell in love with the mountains almost as quickly as she had fallen in love with James. Sarah, true to her word, stayed close to home. She married a young rancher from a neighboring valley, and they built their home within a few hours' ride of the Whitmore cabin. She visited often, bringing her own children as they came along, and the cabin that had once housed a solitary man now rang regularly with the laughter of grandchildren. Daniel, when he reached adulthood, surprised everyone by deciding to study medicine. He had inherited his father's need to help and heal people, combined with his mother's knowledge of herbs and remedies. He apprenticed with a doctor in Jerome Junction, then traveled east for formal education before returning to set up a practice that served the scattered communities of the Arizona Territory. He never forgot the story of how his father had saved his mother's life with knowledge and determination, and he carried that inspiration into his own calling. Cade and Julia grew old together in the cabin where their life had begun. Cade's dark hair turned silver, his strong body eventually showing the wear of decades of hard physical labor. But he remained vital and engaged, taking his grandchildren on the same mountain expeditions he had once taken his own children on, teaching a new generation about the land he loved. Julia's beauty matured into something even more striking, her spirit as fierce and bright as ever, her wisdom sought by children and grandchildren alike. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. The little cabin had been expanded multiple times over the years to accommodate such gatherings, and it was filled to bursting with family. As Cade looked around at all the lives that had grown from that desperate day by Skull Creek, at the love and laughter filling his home, he felt a contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. Julia found him standing on the porch later, looking out at the mountains in the fading light. She moved to his side, slipping her hand into his as naturally as she had been doing for 30 years. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Everything," Cade said. "How one choice, one moment, can change everything. If I had ridden a different path that day, if I had decided you were too far gone to save, if you had not fought to survive. But you did find me, and you did save me, and I did survive," Julia said. "And look at what we built from that moment. Look at our family, our life. This is what love does, Cade. It keeps us alert when our bodies want to rest. It keeps us fighting when giving up would be easier. It gives us the strength to do things we never thought possible." "You gave me that," Cade said, turning to face her, his hands coming up to frame her face just as he had that first time he asked her to stay. "You came into my life and showed me what I was missing. You taught me that love is not something to fear, but something to embrace with both hands." "We taught each other," Julia corrected gently. "You showed me what real strength looks like, what true protection and care mean. You gave me a home not just in this place, but in your heart. Everything good in my life came from that day you found me." They stood together as the stars emerged, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of knowing each other. Inside, their family was gathering for dinner, voices calling for them to come join. But for just a moment more, they remained on the porch, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that had sustained them through everything life had thrown at them. As they finally turned to go inside, Cade pulled Julia close one more time. "I love you," he said, as he had said countless times over the years, from that first moment to this one and forever beyond. "I love you too," Julia replied, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "My mountain man, my protector, my love." The evening stretched ahead of them filled with family and celebration, but it was just one evening in a life filled with such moments. Cade and Julia had learned that love was not just the passion of youth or the quiet companionship of age, but all the moments in between. It was staying awake when exhaustion demanded sleep because the person you loved needed you. It was building a life together one choice at a time, one day at a time. It was facing challenges as a team and celebrating victories together. It was creating a family and a legacy that would extend far beyond their own lives. In the years that followed that celebration, life continued its natural progression. Cade and Julia eventually became great-grandparents, marveling at how the family tree had grown from just the two of them. They slowed down as age demanded, but never stopped being active in the lives of their descendants. The cabin remained a gathering place, the heart of a family that now numbered in the dozens. When Cade was in his 70s, he fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For days, he fought the sickness, and Julia sat by his side just as he had once sat by hers. She bathed his fevered face, forced medicine and fluids into him, and refused to leave his side despite the pleading of their children. "He stayed awake 3 days for me," she told them firmly. "I can do no less for him." Her vigil and the stubborn strength Cade had always possessed pulled him through, though he recovered more slowly than he would have in his youth. When he was finally well enough to sit up and take notice, he found Julia asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hand still holding his. Looking at her, her hair now white, her face lined with age but still beautiful to him, Cade felt the same surge of love he had felt the first time he saw her awake and alert in this same bed all those decades ago. "Julia," he said softly, not wanting to startle her but needing her to wake. Her eyes opened immediately, alert despite her exhaustion. "Thank you for fighting for me." "Always," Julia said simply, standing to sit on the edge of the bed. "We fight for each other. That is what we have always done." They had a few more good years after that, years of relative peace and contentment. They celebrated the milestones of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, attended weddings and christenings, and remained pillars of strength for their family. They took walks together in the mountains when weather permitted, moving more slowly now but still finding joy in the land they had made their home. When Julia began to fail, there was no single illness or injury to point to. She simply grew frailer, her body finally wearing out after a life fully lived. Cade tended her with the same devotion she had shown him, but they both knew this was different. When their children gathered at the cabin, Julia greeted them with smiles and love, but also with clear-eyed acceptance of what was coming. On a peaceful autumn evening, very much like the day they had married more than 50 years earlier, Julia died with Cade holding her hand, surrounded by the family they had created together. Her passing was gentle, slipping from sleep into death so quietly that for a moment Cade thought she was simply resting. When he realized she was gone, the grief that hit him was like a physical blow. But underneath it was a profound gratitude for every moment they had shared. The family buried Julia in a spot overlooking the mountains she had loved, where wildflowers bloomed in spring and the view stretched on forever. Cade stood at her grave for a long time after everyone else had left, talking to her as he had always talked to her, telling her about his day, about the grandchildren, about his plans. It was a habit he would continue for the rest of his days, visiting her grave regularly to share his life with her, even though she was no longer physically present to hear. Cade lived for 5 more years after Julia's death. They were not easy years, the loneliness sometimes overwhelming, but he was sustained by his family and by the knowledge that he had been blessed beyond measure. He had found love when he least expected it, built a family from that love, and lived to see the impact of their union spreading through generations. His children worried about him being alone in the cabin, but Cade refused to leave. This was where he had brought Julia as his bride, where they had raised their children, where every corner held memories. Daniel and his wife moved into the cabin to stay with him, providing companionship and care, but respecting his need to remain in the home he had shared with Julia. In his final days, as Cade lay in the same bed where Julia had recovered from her fever all those decades ago, he was surrounded by family. His children and many of his grandchildren made the journey to say goodbye, and the cabin was once again full of the people whose existence was a testament to the love he and Julia had shared. On his last evening, Cade seemed unusually alert and peaceful. He spoke to each of his children, sharing memories and wisdom. To James, he spoke of the importance of experiencing the world, but always remembering where home was. To Sarah, he praised her strength and her choice to build her life in the place she loved. To Daniel, he expressed pride in the healing work his youngest son had made his life's calling. As the evening wore into night and his children settled around the cabin to keep watch, Cade seemed to drift in and out of awareness. Daniel, sitting beside the bed, heard his father murmur, "I am coming, Julia." I stayed as long as I could. In the early hours of the morning, as the stars wheeled overhead and the mountains stood sentinel around the cabin, Cade Whitmore died peacefully. The family buried him next to Julia, as he had requested, so that even in death they would not be separated. The legacy Cade and Julia left behind was not measured in wealth or possessions, but in the family they had raised and the values they had instilled. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried forward the lessons of fighting for life, of caring for others, of building a life based on love and integrity. The cabin remained in the family, maintained as a gathering place and a reminder of where it all began. James took on the responsibility of keeping the family history alive, writing down the stories his parents had told him. The story of how his father found his mother more than half dead by Skull Creek became a family legend, told to each new generation. The image of Cade staying awake for 3 days, fighting exhaustion because love kept him alert when his body wanted rest, became a symbol for the family of what true love and commitment looked like. Years after both Cade and Julia had passed, Sarah sat on the porch of the old cabin with her own grandchildren, looking out at the mountains. The children had been asking about their great-great-grandparents, wanting to know about the people whose choices had shaped their family. Sarah, now an old woman herself, smiled and began the story the way it had been told to her. "Your great-great-grandfather found your great-great-grandmother dying by a creek in these mountains," she said. "She had been shot and was burning with fever, and most men would have passed her by or done what they could and moved on. But something happened when he found her. Something connected them even before either of them understood what it was. He carried her to his cabin, and for 3 days and 3 nights, he did not sleep. He stayed by her side, fighting to keep her alive because love kept him alert when his body wanted rest." The children listened with wide eyes, captivated by the story they had heard before but never tired of hearing again. Sarah continued, telling them about the courtship and the wedding, about the family that grew from that desperate beginning, about the love that sustained Cade and Julia through everything life threw at them. She told them about the values their great-great-grandparents had lived by and the legacy they had left behind. "Remember," Sarah said as the story came to its close, "that love is not just a feeling, it is a choice, made over and over again. It is staying awake when you want to sleep, fighting when it would be easier to give up, building when you could simply exist. That is what your great-great-grandparents taught us, and that is what we pass on to you." The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in colors that seemed almost impossibly beautiful. Inside the cabin, the rest of the family was gathering for dinner, continuing the tradition of coming together that Cade and Julia had established so long ago. The children ran ahead to join the others, but Sarah sat for a moment longer, feeling the presence of her parents in the wind through the pines and the last light touching the peaks. "Thank you," she whispered to the mountain air. "Thank you for finding each other. Thank you for fighting for love. Thank you for showing us how to live." The mountains, eternal and unchanging, stood as they always had, holding the stories of all who had lived among them. The story of Cade and Julia Whitmore, of a mountain man who stayed awake 3 days nursing a stranger's fever, because love kept him alert when his body wanted rest, would be told and retold through the generations, inspiring others to fight for love, to choose connection over isolation, to build lives of purpose and meaning. And in the quiet moments, in the wind through the pines and the call of birds at dawn, some swore they could still feel the presence of that love, strong and enduring as the mountains themselves, a testament to the power of two people who found each other against all odds and built something that would last long after they were gone.